When we think about consent in healthcare, we think about patients being able to make a decision freely on their own will. When a doctor holds so much power over a patient, that decision becomes a lot less free. That's what makes Norberg v. Wynrib a very important Canadian case. In Norberg v. Wynrib, the Supreme Court of Canada looked at a situation involving a woman who was dependent on prescription drugs and her doctor who controlled the access to those prescriptions. The woman argued that the doctor used his position and her vulnerability to pressure her into a sexual relationship. The Supreme Court unanimously upheld their claim, although the judges reached that result on three different legal bases. Consent in healthcare is a lot less about if the patient actually technically says yes or no, and more about if that decision is allowed to be meaningful, as there is a power imbalance between the doctor and the patient. The patient relies on the doctor for things like medication and ongoing treatment, which makes this doctor patient relationship much different than a regular relationship. For an individual in the healthcare system, this case matters because it protects autonomy in a more realistic way. It reminds us that patients have the right to make decisions without manipulation or coercion, especially when they are vulnerable. A patient might agree to something because they feel pressure, fear losing access to treatment, or simply do not feel able to say no to someone in authority. Norberg v. Wynrib shows that healthcare consent can be understood in context. For an individual in the healthcare system, this case is important because it drives protection for autonomy in individuals. It reminds us that patients have the ability to make decisions without manipulation or coercion involved, especially when they're vulnerable. A patient might agree to something because they feel pressured, worried to lose treatment, or simply do not feel comfortable saying no to a person in power. Norberg v. Wynrib shows that healthcare consent has a big implication in the healthcare system. If I were explaining this case to a friend or family member, I would explain it almost like a boss controlling your paycheck or a landlord controlling where they have a place to live. Even if you say yes to something, it's hard to call that completely free choice when the other person has so much power over something that you need. In this case, the doctor controlled the access to prescriptions, so the court recognized that the patient's consent could not be looked at as fully voluntary in a normal way, as the patient was essentially held hostage. This is taking away their ability to make their own decisions uncontested on their own free will. It also pushes us to think more broadly about power in healthcare. Not all pressure is, and not all coercion is, direct. Sometimes the problem is the relationship itself and the power imbalance built into it. That's why this case matters beyond the courtroom. It also Operationally, this case shows that healthcare systems need strong processes to prevent abuse, not just punish it afterwards. That includes clear reporting systems, proper oversight, staff training, and policies that protect vulnerable patients. This matters because if those systems are weak, trust can break down and harm can spread beyond one more case. In the end, this case is important because it reminds us that consent in healthcare cannot be separated from power, trust, and vulnerability. For the individual in healthcare, it reminds us that our autonomy is important and should be protected. For the healthcare system, it reminds us the importance of ethical boundaries and vulnerability. This case should not be taken only politically, but personally and socially too.